Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar on the integration of climate change and environmental topics into social work. You've taken a great step in fighting environmental injustices just by being here, and Lily and I really appreciate your willingness to learn about a topic that means so much to us. Today's objectives are to bring awareness to social workers' responsibility to respond to environmental injustices, including environmental racism and disproportionate impacts of climate change, in addition to providing strategies and examples for incorporating environmental and climate justice topics into social work curriculum. Overall, we want to normalize environmental and climate-focused conversations within the social work profession. Things we will cover today include what is environmental justice, past social work responses, eco-interventions for all levels of practice, and strategies and examples of incorporating environmental and climate justice topics into social work curriculum. So let's get started with this concept called environmental justice. The fact of the matter is that the consequences of climate change do not impact us equally. In reality, those who contribute the least to the problem are typically those who experience the worst of its effects. They're also usually those who are less able to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disaster. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, in order to achieve environmental justice, all people must have the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal representation in the decision-making processes pertaining to environmental protection, regulation, and policy. Now, if you ask us, these values of equality and equity sound pretty familiar. As social workers, we are change agents, and therefore we play a big role in achieving environmental justice. And it's our responsibility to advocate for the natural environment and our duty to protect against avoidable suffering. One example of an environmental injustice is the fact that the top 10 counties in the US most prone to climate disaster, including extreme heat and flooding, are made up of populations that are 81% Black and Hispanic on average. Uh, this is not a coincidence. Chronic systemic racism has led to the forced migration of minorities to these undesirable and damage prone areas. And these communities typically lack accessibility to resources needed to recover from environmental disaster.
As we discussed previously, those who end up in areas more vulnerable to environmental disaster and poor living conditions, it's no coincidence. They're primarily communities of color. And we wanted to highlight East St. Louis because we are from Missouri and it's close to home for us. And it's a huge crisis that has not yet been confronted by the field of social work and is largely ignored. The population of East St. Louis is 98% Black. And because of the living conditions there, they have one of the highest child asthma rates in the country. There are higher rates of lead poisoning, unemployment, and toxic exposure. Chemical plants surround the East St. Louis neighborhood, and nearly a third of residents live on less than $7,500 a year. And so they're unable to escape the situation and they're forced to stay there and deal with these hazardous conditions. So we've included a map here of the hazardous waste sites in East St. Louis. And on the next slide, I'll be sharing a quote from Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequalities, which I highly encourage you to read if you have not. And so we'll discuss that a little more on the next slide. This is a quote about East St. Louis from Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequalities. And I won't read it for you, but I highly recommend that you take the time to read it on your own. It highlights, I think, really beautifully and tragically what's going on in East St. Louis. He describes it as a scar of sorts, a place that we widely neglect. And I think we wanted to have it here so we could really consider what our responsibility is as social workers. For those of us in Missouri, this is happening so close to us, and it's largely ignored by the city of St. Louis, our state, I think it could be compared to Flint, Michigan in the inaction. And I think it's also important to consider that while this might not be an acute natural disaster or something that draws a lot of media attention, it's more of a slow moving tragedy that is happening gradually, but having real and disastrous impact on those living in the community of East St. Louis. And it is an example of environmental racism. So I think we need to treat it with the same urgency that we do any other example of racism. The Black Lives Matter movement has been incredibly prominent, and rightly so. And I think it's our responsibility to lift up the voices from East St. Louis and confront this. And I'm sure for those of us not in Missouri to look around and say, what is going on like this near me? And what is my responsibility as a social worker to face this? And what are we going to do about it? So, on the next slide, we will discuss Hurricanes Katrina, Irma, and Maria. Katrina is not thought to be a direct link to human caused climate change. Hurricanes Irma and Maria are more likely to be directly related to the global warming. So I did want to highlight this quote because before we talk about the social work response, I think it's important to highlight the racial and class disparities that were present, and they do overlap in both these situations. I did want to mention, though, that while Hurricane Katrina did have these at play, they received much more support from FEMA and the US government, and Puerto Rico and the other Caribbean islands that were directly hit by Maria and Irma were largely ignored, and they did not receive the resources that they needed to recover. So while both were extreme tragedies, one was taken a little bit more seriously by the US government and responded to with a little bit more urgency. However, it's still important to think about the situation that was at play and recognize that typically those with lower socioeconomic status do not have the resources and the money to flee, while those of higher socioeconomic status are more likely to and also live in areas that generally aren't hit as bad by these natural disasters. And while there is a lot more to be said about the class and racial disparities that we discussed on the previous slide, because of time and keeping things short, I want to focus just on the social work responses to these environmental disasters. And later on, we'll discuss the barriers that are more deeply rooted in some of those things that we talked about on the previous slide. So, some of the ways in which social workers were able to respond in these crisis situations are listed here. Those included assisting families in finding loved ones, triaging evacuees, identifying housing, food resources, and financial assistance, providing emotional support, and even providing grief counseling. So, some of the things we think about with therapeutic support, as well as case management services, and just generally supporting wherever needed in these crisis scenarios. So, some barriers to the social work response in these three scenarios. One is widespread confusion. In Hurricane Katrina, social workers talked about there being a disconnect between the disaster response and the therapy response, and some social workers not knowing how to triage and trying to provide therapeutic services when it should have been more crisis related. So there was a bit of confusion there and not a lot of clarity in terms of what social workers should be doing and the services they should be providing in that moment. Local social workers were also experiencing displacement, and this was a problem in Hurricane Katrina as well as Maria and Irma, where social workers were living in the impacted areas and, of course, were dealing with the crisis themselves, which can make it difficult to provide support for others. Um, there was also lack of long-term care plans for survivors, and while the disaster response and crisis management were present, there was not always support following the initial disaster, and people needed longer-term case management services and therapeutic support following these huge displacements. And so this goes into the next point, which is the effort ceasing after the immediate disaster intervention. And social workers also discuss the necessity of state guidelines and formal roles for social workers because since those weren't present, it was hard for them to figure out what exactly they were meant to be doing and then to provide the care that was necessary. And so in Hurricanes Irma and Maria, there was also less FEMA funding, and social workers reported a decrease in available resources and basic necessities. So, while most basic necessities were accessible to social workers helping people displaced by Katrina, this was not the case in Irma and Maria, and it was a large struggle for social workers to try to provide these services when they didn't even have access to basic needs. Looking beyond these specific scenarios that we discussed, we also wanted to highlight opportunities for clinical intervention in climate change and eco-social work as a whole. And we will likely see a large amount of climate refugees in the future, and there will be an increasing amount of disasters such as Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria. So it's really important that as social workers and as a field, we prepare for the types of assessments we need to do and cater those for the type of client that we'll be working with. So it's really important to take into account the specific client population and the exact scenario that they're experiencing. And so while we can't predict that, we can use past natural disasters and climate change related events to inform where we go in the future. And some places like Tuvalu are already experiencing large climate disaster. And so as social workers, we can look to those places and examine their response now and think about how we can use that to inform our practice. And so while I will not discuss Tuvalu in more detail than just briefly mentioning it, we will provide additional resources that you can access to find out more if that's something that you're interested in. So, overall, some clinical interventions for these populations could be conducting needs assessments. Resource brokering is very important, connecting them with families, as we mentioned before with the hurricanes, connecting them to community housing and immigration resources, providing trauma counseling, grief counseling, adjustment and assessment of possible adjustment disorders, group counseling and support for survivors, and always remembering to work from a framework of cultural pluralism. So, if you're working with climate refugees, to be cognizant that refugees, it's important to help them retain their cultural practice and identity while still complementing and participating in the cultural practice of where they settle. So, taking all those things into account and coming from a lens of understanding that forced migration and its unique stressors, you have to meet the client where they're at, understand their specific experience, and what needs they might experience as climate refugees. And this could even be making sure that you're connecting them with medical resources who are trauma informed and who understand the specific needs related to their crisis. So, there's a large range of things that I think are necessary to consider when intervening clinically. And so this is just a very, very baseline starting point, but we want to get you thinking about where the field of social work could possibly go. And clearly, there is a lot of room here for improvement.
There are a number of ways that social workers can get involved at the meso and macro levels. Examples include advocating for the concept of a climate refugee to be recognized legally and officially, advocating for more inclusive immigration policies, organizing disaster preparedness plans for at risk communities, educating social workers and community members about climate change's disproportionate effects, fighting for policies and regulations that hold corporations accountable for environmental destruction and injustices, as well as access to healthcare services and coverage. After all, climate change is indeed a public health issue.
So, once again, I'm not going to read this quote for you, but I think it does demonstrate the urgency needed to respond to this situation. And it is a call to action for all of us as social workers. So, I would encourage you to take the time to read it and really think about what it means for us as a profession. we're already seeing the effects of global warming, and we know that this is just a massive crisis coming our way, and it's going to hit marginalized communities harder. And we have an ethical duty to support those communities and help them through this and connect them with resources and really use our profession to respond to this crisis. So I think this is the time that we should be saying, what are we as a profession going to do about this? It is our ethical duty to recognize that this crisis is occurring and is going to have real impact on us and the communities around us. And I think it's far past time to start preparing for that. And so I would really encourage you to read this and consider what you can do in your own practice to begin preparing for this, and how can we advocate for our clients, and how can we advocate for climate change science as a whole and let others know that this is already happening and it's something that we are called to do. So I think it's going to take the entire social work profession, but I also think it's really hopeful because we are uniquely situated because of our ethical values and the things that we learn about to respond to the climate crisis. So I think while it can be scary and at times seem a little abstract and far off, I think it's already here and we are more ready than we think we are. We think it is really important to integrate eco-social work and climate change social work into the BSW and MSW curriculum. And then we will be prepping a new generation of social workers to graduate and go out and tackle these problems. And this isn't necessarily something that has been present throughout our social work education. And I think that's just because of a general lack of awareness and not a lot of room for that to be discussed. But I think that it's certainly possible. And it's something that we felt was really important because these are the classes that our future social workers are going to take. And it's going to inform the things that they do when they graduate with their BSW or MSW, the type of work they pursue, and the type of research they might decide to work on. There's just a whole host of things that including it in the curriculum could do for this problem. And it would be really amazing if we had people watch this webinar who were social work instructors and they decided to incorporate some of this into their student learning. And I think that's one of our greatest hopes and wishes for this webinar. So we won't go into too much detail on these slides, but we will attach a handout with our suggestions. And of course, the instructors know best, what's needed for student learning and where they can incorporate it in their own classroom. So for professional social work practice, we have some suggestions, and for research methods here. And feel free to pause and read those, and we'll have more on the next couple of slides. So like before, I won't go into a lot of detail. I will just highlight the two courses we have listed on this. So human behavior in the social environment and social policy and social delivery. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities in these two courses as well to integrate some of these topics. So if you happen to be an instructor of one of these courses or a student in one of these courses, it would be great if you took the time to read these and hopefully integrate them in some way into your classroom.
These are some suggestions we have for incorporating environmental topics into large group theory, social work administration, and DSM courses. Again, you can find these in your handout as well. And we also want to note that many of the suggestions that we have covered can be expanded upon and applied to most PPNA or clinical concentration courses and electives. If you have any questions at all about the information that we've covered so far, feel free to reach out to either of us at our emails below. If you are reaching out to us after May of 2021, please use our Gmail accounts. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to us throughout this webinar. We will leave you with this motivating quote from the late Albert Einstein that says, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything." On the next slides, we have additional resources that we recommend for anyone who wants to learn more about environmental and climate justice topics. And these resources are also included in the handout provided with this webinar. The first resources that we are recommending are the Social Work Promoting Community and Environmental Sustainability ebooks. There's 3 of them, all written by the same 2 amazing authors, both of which are social workers. And all 3 ebooks cover a wide variety of environmental topics, so we recommend you checking them out. They also have resources as far as ways to incorporate it into curriculum, activities, exercises, etc. We also created an environmental social work reading list, which is linked in the slides as well as in your handout. So we recommend checking that out for various books and articles and different materials that we recommend. We also recommend you checking out the grand challenges for social work, specifically create the social responses to a changing environment section. That is also linked. And then we have also listed several recommended documentaries for you to watch in your free time.
Lastly, for additional resources, we've listed some organizations to check out if you want to learn more about the climate crisis or get involved. Those include the International Federation of Social Workers, the Climate Justice Alliance, the Sierra Club, Sustain Mizzou, City of Columbia Office of Sustainability, the Climate Reality Project, Earth Justice, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And of course, some of these are local to our area at the University of Missouri, but others like the IFSW and the IPCC, the Climate Reality Project, are not local. And I would really encourage you to check out those resources and organizations, because I think you will learn a lot about climate change. And it certainly helped us get really excited about this topic. And I know that we are looking for ways to get involved and constantly asking ourselves, we've made this webinar, now what are we going to do about it? So I think this is just the first step. And I hope that you all will join us in confronting this crisis. And that's, the whole purpose of making this is to hopefully get some more people excited about this topic, and not to promote anxiety and fear, but to really hear this call and this ethical duty that I think we all share, and to say, now let's get together and solve this. So I highly encourage these resources, and thank you so much for listening.